Guys, welcome back to Coach Hall Writes. Today's video is actually a request from my own students. They wanted to know how to earn the sophistication point for an AP Lang synthesis essay. Before we get started, I want to give a quick disclaimer, and that is that the sophistication point is actually very difficult to earn. So even though I'm going to give you guys some tips that hopefully you can apply to your future essays, I do not guarantee that anyone will earn the sophistication point just by watching this video. For the synthesis essay, it's important to remember that you are trying to develop an argument. You're using the provided sources to support your position. And so think of it like this. When you read a passage for rhetorical analysis, you are analyzing the choices that that writer has made in order to develop his or her argument. But when you write an essay, you are the writer, you're the author, and you have to make choices to develop your argument. So one of the choices that you can make that might offer a nuanced argument is that you could choose to offer a counterclaim and rebuttal or a concession and refutation. They're very similar. But one thing to keep in mind is that we don't want to just drop this in and have it be one or two sentences and then move on. If you truly want to add a layer of sophistication to your writing, you really need to dig deep with either the counterclaim and rebuttal or the concession and refutation. Doing so is one way to add a layer of sophistication to your essay. With a synthesis essay, you need to develop a position. So what that means is that you need to pick a side. You need to assert a position and then develop your reasoning as to why that position is correct. So the opposite of that is going to be the counter argument. So once you've decided what your position is that you're going to argue, you could think about what other people would say against that. That's the counter argument. Now, there are two different terms here. We've got counterclaim and rebuttal and concession and refutation. They are pairs. So you want to make sure that you actually write them as pairs, because if you just acknowledge the counter argument, but you don't actually refute it, then it seems like you're arguing in favor of both sides, which is actually called equivocation, and we don't want to do that. So remember that these come as pairs. Now, I like to see students try to offer a concession just because I think sometimes that is a little bit softer. So a concession is when you acknowledge the merit of the other side, but you still assert that your position is correct. You might be wondering, how does acknowledging the counter argument and then refuting it add a layer of nuance to your argument? And the reason is that if you are able to think about other perspectives and then say why they're wrong and why your position is correct, it shows that you've thought about the issue beyond just what you want to argue. So it seems like you've done your research, it seems like you've thought about the issue, and so it also helps to build your own credibility as a writer. In working with my own students, I've found that depending on the prompt or sometimes depending on the student, students can readily identify the counter argument. But then there are other times where students feel like they get stuck. So if you feel like you're stuck, I would recommend turning to the sources themselves, because the sources are going to offer different perspectives. And oftentimes there are going to be a couple sources that agree with each other or build off of each other, but then there might be other sources that contradict that particular position. So if you're trying to figure out how to actually come up with a counter argument, you might be able to use the sources as inspiration. Now that you're comfortable with the terminology, you're probably wondering, how exactly do I write a concession and refutation? Well, I have a separate video that goes into this topic in a lot more detail, and it includes some examples. So I will link that here in the iCards above, but I want to give you guys a quick crash course. So basically, you need to think about what the opposite side actually is. You also want to think about the merit of this argument, especially if you're doing a concession, because that shows that you've thought about the value of the other side, but you're ultimately going to refute it to prove that your position is the one that needs to be considered. And then the final step is to acknowledge what the other side fails to consider. So basically, using a concession and refutation or a counterclaim and rebuttal is a way to develop your argument, because you're acknowledging the counter argument, but you're also explaining why the counter argument is misguided or why it has shortcomings. So this is a way to further your own position and make your argument more convincing. Remember that because you are the writer, you get to make choices. So not only do you get to choose whether or not you want to include a concession and refutation, you also get to choose where you're going to include it in your argument. So you want to think about a couple things. Where is it going to be most convincing? Some students like to include it in the beginning. Other students like to include it in the end. It's just important to keep track of the pacing and the time that you have remaining, especially if you're practicing for the exam. You don't want to get most of the way through addressing the counter argument and then run out of time and not be able to actually refute it. So do keep an eye on the time, but ask yourself, where does this best belong? So where does it belong logically in terms of what I'm attempting to argue? It's important to recognize that a synthesis essay is a conversation of sources, which means that your job is not to summarize the sources, but rather your job is to use the sources to support your argument. For a synthesis essay, it's important that you cite 3 different sources. So you're going to be provided with anywhere from 6 to 8 sources. You need to cite 3 different sources at some point in your essay. And it's okay to cite more than 3 sources, but you need a minimum of 3. So oftentimes what students ask is, so does that mean I need 3 body paragraphs? They assume that because they need 3 sources, that there's supposed to be 1 source per paragraph. And while that's not necessarily the wrong way to approach it, it is a limiting belief. And so what we want to think about is that since we need layers of evidence and commentary in our body paragraphs, we can actually put 2 different sources in the same body paragraph to start this conversation. So it might be that the 2 sources have similar perspectives. It might be that somehow the topics are related and we can use evidence from one, offer some commentary, and then cite the other source and offer more commentary. Or the sources might contradict each other, so you could actually use one of the sources to set up your concession and refutation. You could use one source as a way to acknowledge the counter argument and then refute it. Another way to earn the sophistication point is to situate the argument in a broader context. Now, unfortunately, sometimes this is a lot harder for certain prompts than others, and there isn't exactly this magical formula that you can follow in order to do this. That being said, there are some things that you're going to want to consider. So depending on the topic that you're writing about, you might have some kind of connection to that topic. Maybe you have outside knowledge from history class or science class. Maybe it's an issue that you have encountered personally, or maybe you are aware of how this issue fits into current events. Maybe you can infer from the documents what this means for society, perhaps in the future. So there are different ways to go beyond the argument and to think about the big picture, but that's really what they mean when they say situate the argument in a broader context. So it is something that I think students can attempt to do in their commentary, but I think there's times when students are going to be more successful at it than others. So I would encourage you to ask yourself, what outside knowledge do I have about this topic? Do I have any relevant personal experience with this topic? And also just what are the implications for society? Because even if you don't earn the sophistication point because of thinking about these things, it could still help your commentary. As you attempt to situate the argument in a broader context, you want to be very careful that you're being specific because generalizations are going to weaken your argument and generalizations are not going to help you earn the sophistication point. The rubric also says that students can earn the sophistication point because of a vivid and persuasive writing style. So it's important to remember that you need one of these elements to earn sophistication, but it needs to be consistent. So just including sophisticated words is not going to earn you the sophistication point. So think back to some of the arguments that you've read in class, perhaps as you were doing a rhetorical analysis. Which choices did those writers make to make their argument more compelling? Was it their word choice? Was it metaphors? Was it the fact that they had a clever play on words? These are things that you might be able to incorporate into your own writing in order to make it more dynamic. Now, keep in mind that some students are going to have a knack for this, whereas others might not. And I have read some wonderful essays that were sophisticated or close to sophisticated in terms of that sophistication point, but they didn't necessarily have this it factor style that we're talking about. So I don't want you to think that you have to incorporate all of these things, but you want to be very targeted. So if you're the type of person that has a very very strong writing voice and you think that's going to make you stand out, then perhaps this is the element that you could focus on. There are also some writing tips that I believe all students should focus on, regardless of whether or not the sophistication point is truly attainable. And the first is to work on combining your sentences. You want to avoid redundancy. This will help the flow of your essay. Something else that's going to help the flow of your essay is to vary your syntax. So syntax is sentence structure. Oftentimes when students are writing under pressure, they forget to vary their sentence length, and so they have a lot of simple declarative sentences back to back. And when we read these types of essays, they sound very choppy. They sound like a list, and so we want to improve the flow by adding in some dependent clauses or introductory phrases. That way it helps the flow of the actual paragraph itself. Something else to consider is your word choice. Like I said previously, you don't want to just try to use sophisticated sounding words for the sake of being sophisticated. Oftentimes, students actually use these words incorrectly. Now, conversely, you don't want to use lower level words when you can come up with a synonym. So you don't want to say words like good, bad, thing, or a lot, because those are lower level words. Another quick fix that's going to improve the quality of your writing is avoiding weak lead-ins. So a lot of times when students are first starting out, they want to lead into their evidence by saying phrases like, according to source A. And while this isn't wrong, it does count as a citation. It actually reads better if you can integrate that quote into a sentence of your own and put the parenthetical citation at the end. Teachers, if you've been watching my videos for a while, you know that I love sentence frames as a means to help students improve their writing, and I use them quite a lot for rhetorical analysis. But I recently put some together for synthesis, and I will link them in the description box below in case you want to get your hands on them as well. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, happy writing!